Hi everyone, welcome back. In today's episode, we're going to continue our discussion of absolute monarchs and turn our attention to France. We're going to look at a series of monarchs and we're going to conclude with Louis XIV, one of the most luxurious and well-known absolute monarchs of his time. So make sure you're on your interactive notebook and you're following along. Let's go ahead and get started. We're on page 3 of your interactive notebook. And again, we're going to talk about the absolute monarchs of France. So let's start off with our essential question for today. In what ways was Louis XIV of France the most powerful monarch of his time? Like I said, we're going to look at a series of different monarchs, but we're going to conclude with Louis XIV. So let's back up and talk about some of the religious wars and power struggles that France was taking place with during this time period. So ever since the Reformation that we talked about in the last unit, the Catholics in France had been fighting with the Protestants in France, and the Protestants were going by a name known as the Huguenots. So we've got Catholics and Protestants fighting against each other. In 1589, a gentleman by the name of Henry of Navarre, he comes to the French throne. He becomes the leader or the king, and he adopts Catholicism as the official religion of France. So that causes problems for those Huguenots because, again, they were Protestant going against the Catholics. Now the state religion is Catholicism, so it doesn't look too good for the Huguenots. He actually issues something known as the Edict of Nantes, and it basically says, my favorite word basically, was a declaration of religious tolerance. So it's, yes, Catholicism is the official religion, but stop persecuting the Protestants. So he comes out with that when he is in office or when he is king. Let's fast forward a few years and talk about this French royal family. Louis XIII, who's pictured here at the top in his very fancy garb. They dressed great back then, didn't they? Louis XIV becomes king. He actually was one of France's weakest kings. He actually had a prime minister who's pictured in kind of more towards the bottom in the red, who was a cardinal. So he's part of the church, Cardinal Richelieu, and he was a very strong leader. Richelieu actually kind of takes more control than Louis XIII and kind of in Louis XIII's name. So he pretty much runs the country and just kind of like Louis XIII is kind of in the background like, hey, I'm the king, but he really wasn't doing much. Richelieu was very powerful, not only in the government, but also in the Catholic Church. And here is where we're going to see kind of that melding of the Catholic Church as well as the government, which other leaders are going to try and go away from. Some of the policies that Richelieu tried to put into place while he was in office or while he was in control, he does increase the power of the Bourbons. The Bourbons are the royal family, so Louis XIII. So he increases their power by limiting the Huguenots' freedom. So he's going to start persecuting those Huguenots or the Protestants while he's there. And then he also starts to take power away from the wealthier class or the nobles, and he gives it to the government officials, which he calls his intendants. Now, Louis XIII passes away, and he actually has a son, Louis XIV. This is a boy. I know it looks very girlish, but they dress very differently than we do today. But this was his son, Louis XIV, and he takes power at the age of 4. So when Louis XIII dies, Louis XIV is only 4 years old, so technically he is the king of France at the time, and he was actually ruling over about 19 million people at the ripe age of 4 years old. Now, technically he wasn't ruling. His mother was still alive. She was technically what was called a regent, so she has a little bit of power, kind of advising. Obviously, they're not advising a 4-year-old, but they have other people in power until he comes of age. So he had a cardinal that was also in charge. I think his name was Mazarin. People didn't really like him. He's in control until his death in the early 1660s. And that's about when Louis XIV was in his early 20s. So historians say by about his early 20s, that's when Louis XIV kind of takes over official power. While he is king, he decides that he wants full power. He does not want a prime minister working with him. He doesn't want the cardinal working with him. He wants nothing. He is 100% absolute ruler. He wants nobody else helping him. So he was very determined to make the monarchy so powerful that nobody could challenge him. He knew what was going on everywhere. He was in total control of everything. So it's one of the biggest reasons why they say he was the most powerful monarch of his time, especially in France. He calls himself the Sun King, and he expands the power of those intendants, and he also expands the power over the nobles. So again, he's taking more power away from the nobles, pouring more power back into the monarchy and into himself. He also appoints a gentleman by the name of Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Ooh, that was pretty good French for me. Colbert as his Minister of Finances. That's not him pictured here. These pictures are both of Louis XIV. That's just one when he was a little bit older. But Colbert was in charge of making France self-sufficient. He doesn't want to rely on imports. If anything, he wants to be doing the exports. He wants to put France on top of the world, basically, at this time period. So Louis XIV was very, as I said, luxurious, very grand. As you can see, as he's depicted in this photograph or this picture here, this portrait, he had lots of different portraits taken of him all throughout his life, or painted of him, I should say. And as you can see, just in his clothing alone, his stature, this man, he lived a life of luxury. Yes, he does have high heels on. Gentlemen, it was high fashion, high class to have heels back then. So don't be thinking he was he was married, he was heterosexual, whatever. But anyway, this was just the style of the day. He was super, he knew what was going on. So he lived very well. He made every single meal he ate a feast, just grand and lavish. And he had a whole agenda of what he did every day. And it was just, the guy lived to the nines all day long. He kept nobles in the palace to increase his power over them, so he could just see what was going on at all times. He built a magnificent palace at Versailles, known as the Palace of Versailles. It's not Versailles, it's Versailles. It is still there today. If you ever go to France, if COVID ever ends, I haven't been there yet, but I want to go see it. But I've heard it's amazing, and you're going to go on a virtual field trip there. But Versailles was his baby, and it was a testament to his life of luxury. Just very magnificent. He was also a center. The Palace of Versailles was a center of the arts during this time period. He bought art. He was posed in art. Louis XIV was a patron of the arts. And he really felt that the purpose of art at this time period in France was to glorify him. Let's talk about the end of his reign. So he brought on a lot of different wars during his reign, and he was trying to attempt to expand France's boundaries and its borders to make it bigger. By 1701, England and some other countries go to war against France and Spain in what becomes known as the War of the Spanish Succession. They were attempting to prevent the union of the French and Spanish throne. So the English don't want the French and the Spanish to team up together. In 1714, it comes to an end, and both France and Spain are not victorious, and they lose some of their holdings and some of their possessions. France, once Louis does come to an end when he dies, there's a mixed feeling about his legacy. Some people felt that he was just this great, powerful ruler. Others are like, nah, he wasn't so fantastic. It was just all about him. And some people would be inclined to agree with that. He did rule and make France a major military power while he was a king, and he also made it a cultural power in Europe. But he also got them involved in multiple wars. He built that giant palace and leaves France with heavy debts. All that spending had to come from somewhere. So again, it's a mixed legacy. He thought he was the best thing in the world. Others were like, I don't know. I don't know that he was really out for France. He was more out for himself. But in terms of absolute monarchs, I think he was one of the absolutist of all, because he wanted all of the power. Next time, we're going to talk about Central Europe. So make sure this is in your interactive notebook and check back then. Thanks for watching.